Chapter 10 of Explorers and Travelers by Adolphus W. Greely. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Tomko. Chapter 10 Isaac Israel Hayes and the Open Polar Sea. History affords many examples wherein neither the originator nor the early advocate of a striking idea has reaped fame therefrom, and their names give way to some persistent, tireless worker who forces the subject on public attention by his ceaseless efforts. Among Arctic theories, none has more fully occupied and interested the mind of the general public than that of an open, navigable sea in the polar regions. In connection with this theory, the minds of Americans turn naturally to Dr. I. Hayes, who, not the originator, inherited his belief therein from the well-known Professor Maury, through the mediation of Kane, Hayes's Arctic commander. DeHaven thought he saw signs of Maury's ice-free sea to the northward of Wellington Strait. Kane, through Morton, found it at Cape Constitution. Hayes recognized it a few miles farther up Kennedy Channel, but Markham turned it into a frozen sea in 83 degrees 20 minutes north latitude, and Lockwood, from Cape Kane, on the most northerly land of all time, rolled the frozen waste yet to the north, beyond the 84th parallel, to within some 350 miles of the geographical pole. Isaac Israel Hayes was born in Chester County, Pennsylvania, March 5, 1832. He gained the title of doctor by graduation in the University of Pennsylvania in 1853, in which year, at 24 hours' notice, he accepted the appointment, procured his outfit, and sailed as surgeon of Kane's Arctic expedition. An account of this voyage appears in the sketch of Dr. Kane, but some further reference to it is now necessary. Hayes, it will be remembered, was the surgeon, a position which exempted him from field work. However, when Kane and others broke down, Hayes volunteered, and was sent with Godfrey, a seaman, and a team of 7 dogs to explore the west coast of Smith Sound. The journey lasted from May 20th to June 1st, 1853, and all things considered, such as defective equipment, rough ice, and attacks of snow blindness, the results were unusually creditable. The rough ice traveled over is thus described by Hayes. We were brought to a halt by a wall of broken ice ranging from 5 to 30 feet in height. We had not a foot of level traveling. Huge masses of ice from 20 to 40 feet in height were heaped together. In crossing these ridges our sledge would frequently capsize and roll over and over, dogs, cargo, and all. Hayes finally reached land on May 27th, at a bluffy headland to the north and east of a little Dobbin Bay, which seemed to terminate about 10 miles inland. This point, called later Cape Hayes, was placed by him by observation in 79 degrees 42 minutes north, 71 degrees 17 minutes west. From his farthest, Hayes mentions the sea flow as continuing in a less rough condition to the northward, and correctly describes the interior of Grinnell Land as a great mountain chain following the trend of the coast. His broken sledge and nearly exhausted provisions obliged Hayes to return, and in so doing he crossed Dobbin Bay to and passed under the shadow of the noble headland of Cape Hawks, where they gave their dogs the last scrap of pemmican. Hayes resolved to here abandon all his extra clothing, sleeping bags, etc., some 40 pounds, a rash act, as they must have been between 60 and 70 miles from the brig, and in case of a storm would have perished. The first day's return journey the dogs were fed with sealskin from old boots and a little lamp lard, and the day following with bread crumbs, lard scrapings, and sealskin off mittens and trousers. The travelers got scanty rest, dozing in the sun on the sledge, and finally reached Rensselaer Harbor, snow-blind and utterly exhausted. Hayes was thus the first white man to put foot on the new land, to which Kane affixed the name of Grinnell. It is impossible to understand Kane's failure to properly recognize this successful and arduous journey of Hayes, and one looks in vain for confirmation of Kane's claim that he renewed and confirmed, in April 1854, the work of Hayes and Godfrey, for his own account shows that Kane's April journey failed completely to reach Grinnell Land. 2 months after his journey to Grinnell Land, Hayes was called on to decide whether he would remain with Kane at Rensselaer Harbor, where the unbroken ice plainly claimed the brig Advance as its own for another year, sharing the hardships and dangers of a second Arctic winter, or, fleeing south without his commander, seek safety and shelter through a boat journey down Smith Sound and across Melville Bay to the northern Danish settlement Upernivik in Greenland. Hayes, unfortunately for his reputation, yielded to the majority, and 9 of the party, headed by Peterson, Sontag, and Hayes, decided to go, while only 6 white men and Eskimo Hans remained. It is true that Kane had only 2 weeks before returned from an unsuccessful attempt to reach Beechy Island, as difficult a task as the voyage to Upernivik, which he had quitted his brig to lead in person. But such action should not have been viewed as a justification for again separating the party. Hayes alleges in extenuation that Kane had previously announced to the crew that their labors would thereafter be directed homeward, that the attempted journey to Beechy Island was solely to procure aid, that the boat journey simply changed the direction of their efforts, save that it was led by Peterson and not by Kane. Further, that the departure of the majority of the crew would give augmented health conditions, space, and food to those who remained. Accepting Kane's permission, freely accorded, as he says, to make the boat journey, liberally equipped with such supplies as the brig had, and assured of a hearty welcome should they return, the boat party left Rensselaer Harbor, August 28, 1853, confident of its ability to succeed. Sudden cold, sledging accidents, and bad ice soon caused Riley to return to the brig, but despite sea-soaked bedding, injured limbs, and exhausting labor, the rest of the boat party persevered with sledge to the open water, and, launching their whaleboat, proceeded rapidly till a closed ice pack stopped them at Littleton Island. It is unnecessary to detail despairing delays or delusive hopes which changing conditions of ice and weather alternately aroused during their southward journey, nor to recite the hardships and perils arising from violent gales, drifting snow, the disruption and closing of the pack, the severe cold of a rapidly advancing winter, their lack of shelter and insufficiency of proper food. Suffice it to say that, confronted by impassable ice floes, they were finally forced, with damaged boat, depleted supplies, and impaired strength, to establish winter quarters south of Cape Parry, midway between Whale and Wolstenholme Sounds. The preservation of stores, construction of shelter, and accumulation of means of subsistence now engrossed their entire energies. The construction of a hut, although facilitated by a rocky cavern, proved to be exhausting in the extreme, from the difficulty of obtaining material from the frozen soil. Their most skillful hunters kept the field continually, but game failed, and from day to day food supply diminished with, to them, startling rapidity. Eventually, reduced to the verge of starvation, they would have perished but for food obtained from the Eskimo, which, though scanty and irregular, yet sustained life. Affairs went from bad to worse, and with the increasing cold and diminishing light of December, it was decided that they must either perish or return to the brig. Either alternative had its advocates. To decide was to act. Peterson negotiated with the Eskimo, and by judicious admixture of persuasion, command, and force, succeeded in having the entire boat party transported by sledge to the Advance, where they were received with fraternal kindness. Hayes relates, "Dr. Kane met us at the gangway and grasped me warmly by the hand. Olson folded me in his arms, and kissing me, threw me into his warm bed." The boat journey to Upernivik, which proved dangerous and impracticable to his small party in advancing winter, proved with the returning summer of 1855 not difficult to the reunited party of Kane, and so ended the boat journey of Hayes and his first Arctic service. The loss of a portion of his foot, extreme sufferings from exposure, and his great privations in the Kane expedition failed to abate Hayes's enthusiasm in Arctic exploration. Immediately on his return to the United States, in October, 1855, he advocated a second expedition, with the object of completing the survey of the north coast of Greenland and Grinnell Island, and to make explorations toward the North Pole. His strenuous efforts to excite public interest failed at first, but Hayes devoted himself to lecturing on Arctic subjects and finally enlisted in his support most of the scientific societies of the country. The advocacy of Professor Bache and Henry and the support of Grinnell gave an impulse which finally resulted in the organization of an expedition under Hayes's command, and on July 6, 1860, he left Boston on the sailing schooner United States with a crew of 14. It is not needful to dwell on his outward voyage farther than to say that, in addition to the complement of dogs and stock of furs usually obtained in Greenland, Hayes there recruited dog drivers, interpreters, and hunters. At Cape York he also added Hans Hendrik, Kane's dog driver, who, smitten with the dusky charms of the daughter of Shang hu, had chosen to remain with the Etah Eskimo rather than return to Danish Greenland with the Kane retreating party in 1855. Now, 5 years later, he showed an equal willingness to quit his adopted tribe for expeditionary purposes. Profiting by the experience of his predecessor, Hayes was unwilling to push a sailing vessel northward into Kane's Basin, beyond the 78th parallel, and wisely decided to establish his winter quarters in Foulke Fiord near Littleton Island, 20 miles to the south and about 40 miles west of Kane's quarters. Game proved abundant both at sea and on land. Pleasant relations were established with their neighbors, the Etah Eskimo, an observatory built, and scientific observations inaugurated. Indeed, everything looked most promising for the future. An autumnal journey of special interest was Hayes' visit to My Brother John Glacier, near Port Foulke, which, up to that time, was the most northerly and one of the most successful attempts to penetrate the glacier covering of Greenland, known commonly as the inland ice. With 7 men he penetrated some 40 miles or more on the ice, when the temperature sinking to the 34 degrees below zero, with wind, compelled their immediate return. The ice changed gradually, as they went inland, from rough to smooth, and the angle of rise decreased from 6 to 2 degrees at their highest, over 5,000 feet. A snowstorm broke on them, and, as Hayes describes, fitful clouds swept over the face of the full-orbed moon, which, descending toward the horizon, glimmered through the drifting snow that hurled out of the illimitable distance, and scudded over the icy plains, to the eye, in undulating lines of downy softness, to the flesh, in showers of piercing darts. Suddenly misfortunes came on them. Peter, an Eskimo dog driver brought from Upernivik, deserted. Hans Hendrik, in his interesting memoir, says, "In the beginning of the winter, Peter turned a kivigtok, that is, fled from human society to live alone up the country. We were unable to make out what might have induced him to do so. Searching for him, at last I found his footprints going to the hills. The poor native was never seen alive, but it eventually transpired that he sought shelter in a remote and rarely visited Eskimo hut, where he died of starvation, his body being found in a very emaciated condition by an Etah native the following spring. Next the dogs began to die of distemper, which led up to the death of Sontag, the astronomer. By the 21st of December only 9 remained of 30 fine dogs, and in this contingency it was decided to open up communication with the Eskimo of Whale Island, some 150 miles to the south, for the purchase of dogs. For this journey Sontag volunteered, and with him went Hans as dog driver. Hayes waited week after week, but no news came from either Sontag or Hans. Then feelings of uneasiness gave place to alarm and fear, for a journey of dodge, first mate proved that the travelers had gone outside Cape Alexander, where the floe had broken, so that possibly they had been lost on drifting ice. Hayes was projecting a personal search on January 29th, when 2 Eskimo visited the ship and reported that Sontag was dead. They proved to be advance couriers of Hans, who arrived a few days later with only 5 of his 9 dogs remaining. In his memoirs Hans relates as follows: "It still blew a gale and the snow drifting dreadfully, for which reason we resolved to return. The ice began breaking up, so we were forced to go ashore and continue our drive over the ice foot. At one place the land became impassable, and we were obliged to return to the ice again. On descending here my companion, Sontag, fell through the ice, which was nothing but a thick sheet of snow and water. I stooped, but was unable to seize him, it being very low tide. As a last resort I remembered a strap hanging on the sledge poles. This I threw to him, and when he had tied it around his body I pulled, but found it very difficult. At length I succeeded in drawing him up, but he was at the point of freezing to death, and now in the storm and drifting snow he took off his clothes and slipped into the sleeping bag, whereupon I placed him on the sledge and repaired to our last resting place. Our road being very rough, I cried for despair from want of help, but I reached the snow hut. He recites that Sontag remained unconscious to his death, and that the breaking up of the ice around Cape Alexander, confirmed by Dodge's journey, prevented his return to the ship at that time. There was much talk about Sontag's death, but Hans's account is doubtless correct. Sontag was the only trained scientific observer in the party, and in addition, from his skill, experience, and enthusiasm in Arctic work, was almost indispensable to Hayes. His death was a great blow to the party, socially as well as professionally. In early spring Hayes succeeded in obtaining the cooperation of the Etah Eskimo in sledging, and in a preliminary journey visited his old winter quarters, where he had served with Kane 6 years before. Where they had abandoned the Advance, surrounded by the solid pack, he found ice nearly as high as were her mastheads. No vestige of the vessel remained except a bit of plank, and its fate was a matter of conjecture, though little doubt exists that she was ultimately crushed by the disruption of the pack during some violent gale. It was during this journey that Hayes experienced an intense degree of cold. Stating that the thermometer which hung inside the hut against the snow wall indicated 31 degrees below zero, Hayes says, "We crawled out in the open air to try the sunshine. I will give you the best buffalo skin in the ship, Jansen, if the air outside is not warmer than in that den which you have left so full of holes." And it really seemed so. Human eye never lit upon a more pure and glowing morning. The sunlight was sparkling all over the landscape, and the great world of whiteness, and the frozen plain, the hummocks, the icebergs, and the tall mountains made a picture inviting to the eye. Not a breath of air was stirring. Jansen gave in without a murmur. I brought out the thermometer and set it up in the shadow of an iceberg near by. I really expected to see it rise, but no, down sank the little red column of alcohol. Down, down, almost to the bulb, until it touched 68½ degrees below zero, Fahrenheit, equal to 100½ degrees below the freezing point of water. It struck me as a singular circumstance that this great depression of temperature was not perceptible to the senses, which utterly failed to give us even so much as a hint that here in this blazing sunlight we were experiencing about the coldest temperature ever recorded. After this preliminary journey Hayes laid down supplies at the nearest point on the Greenland shore south of and facing Cape Hawkes. This place, called Cairn Point, was to be the base of his summer's campaign to the north. Finally everything was ready for the main journey, and the party started on the night of April 3, 1861. 12 men, the entire available force, were put into the field, Jansen with an 8-dog sledge, Knorr with a 6-dog sledge, and a 10-man sledge on which was mounted a 20-foot metallic lifeboat with which Hayes hoped to navigate the Polar Sea. The journey lay directly to the north over the frozen surface of Kane Sea, where the difficulties of travel through the broken hummocky ice were so great and the unfitness of some of the men for Arctic travel so speedily developed that Hayes was forced to abandon his efforts to get the boat across the frozen sea, which, he says, could not have been done by 100 men. On April 24th Hayes records that he had been 22 days from the schooner, and was now distant only 30 miles from Cairn Point. 4 days later, still struggling across the rough ice of Kane Sea, the party was practically broken down, being, as Hayes chronicles, barely capable of attending to their own immediate necessities without harboring the thought of exerting themselves to complete a journey to which they can see no termination, and in the very outset of which they feel that their lives are being sacrificed. In this critical condition Hayes changed his plans, and sent back the entire party to the brig, except Knorr, Jansen, and McDonald, whom he selected as best fitted to make the northern journey, which he had decided to make with 14 dogs and 2 sledges. Turning northward with renewed confidence and vigor, though yet struggling with various misfortunes through a tangle of broken hummocks, Hayes reached Cape Hawks on May 11th. The condition of the ice may be judged from the fact that he had been 31 days in making a distance of 80 miles, a little more than 2 miles a day. 3 days' farther march took him to Cape Frazier, where the flagstaff erected by him in 1853 yet stood erect. At the end of the next march, where they were driven to the sea ice owing to the impossibility of following the ice foot, Hayes ascended the hillside, whence he says, "No land was visible to the eastward," as it would not have been difficult through such an atmosphere to see a distance of 50 or 60 miles. It would appear, therefore, that Kennedy Channel is somewhat wider than heretofore supposed. On May 15th, Jansen was disabled for traveling by a sprained back and injured leg, and the next morning was scarcely able to move. Hayes decided to leave the disabled man in charge of McDonald and proceed with Knorr, his purpose being "to make the best push I could and travel as far as my provisions warranted, reach the highest attainable latitude, and secure such a point of observation as would enable me to form a definite opinion respecting the sea before me." Rough ice and deep snow so impeded his progress the first day that he only made 9 miles in as many hours. 10 hours' march compelled them to again camp, and 4 hours of the third day brought them to the southern cape of a bay which he determined to cross. After traveling 4 miles, the rotten ice and frequent water channels proved that the bay was impassable, and therefore they went into camp. The next day Hayes climbed to the top of the cliff, some 800 feet high, whence he says, "The sea beneath me was a mottled sheet of white and dark patches multiplied in size as they receded until the belt of the water sky blended them together. All the new evidence showed that I stood upon the shores of the polar basin, and that the broad ocean lay at my feet. There was seen in dim outline the white sloping summit of a noble headland, the most northern known land upon our globe. I judge it to be in latitude 82 degrees 30 minutes north, or 450 miles from the North Pole. There was no land visible except the coast on which I stood." Hayes, before returning to his ship, deposited in a cairn a record, dated May 19, 1861, setting forth his trip, stating that his observations placed him in 81 degrees 35 minutes north latitude and 70 degrees 30 minutes west longitude, that his further progress was stopped by rotten ice and cracks, that he believed the polar basin was navigable during the months of July, August, and September, and that he would make an attempt to get through Smith Sound when the ice broke that summer. The extent and scope of Hayes's discoveries, as set forth in his account of the expedition in the open polar sea, gave rise to persistent and adverse criticism both as to the soundness of his judgment and also as to the accuracy of his observations. 3 expeditions, by their later surveys, have demonstrated that the astronomical position assigned by Hayes to his farthest on the east coast of Grinnell Land is impossible. There is unmistakably an error either of latitude or of longitude. Cape Joseph Good, it is to be remarked, is in the longitude assigned by Hayes, while Cape Lieber is no less than 6½ degrees to the eastward. Reversely, Lieber corresponds nearly to Hayes's latitude, while Cape Joseph Good is a degree and a half to the south. Grave and undisputable errors in other latitudes, all being too far to the north, indicate that the mistake in this instance is also of latitude. In justice to Hayes, it should be said that the latitude of his farthest depended solely on a single observation with a small field sextant of the meridian altitude of the sun. While this is the common method on shipboard, it is exceedingly objectionable in Arctic land determinations. It depends not only on the honesty of the observer, but on the condition of the sextant, and also on the manner in which it is handled. Either of these 3 qualities being faulty, the observation is incorrect. The tendency of the sextant to slip as it is turned over for reading, and the almost invariably benumbed condition of the hands of the traveler, indicate the extreme difficulty of making any single reading with accuracy. Again, with haste demanded so often by adverse circumstances, the index of a very small sextant may be misread a whole degree. It is unquestioned that one or the other of these accidents happened to Hayes, for the independent investigations of Bessel's, Schott, and others lead to the inevitable conclusion, which any scientist may verify by examination of Hayes's widely separated data, that his farthest is placed too far north. The consensus of opinion in the Lady Franklin expedition pointed to Cape Joseph Good, 80 degrees 14 minutes north, as Hayes's farthest, as it agreed better with Hayes's description than any other point. It may be added that from this cape Hayes could not see the Greenland coast above Cape Constitution, which he leaves blank on his chart, and again here the unusually heavy spring tides of nearly 25-foot range break up the southern half of the flows of Kennedy Channel, thus forming early in the year large water spaces, the open polar sea of Hayes and Morton. Even if Hayes's sight of the open polar sea proved visionary, and certain unskilled observations failed of verification, yet his adventurous voyage was not barren of geographical results. He was the first civilized man to land on the shores of Ellesmere Land, along the coasts of which, between the 77th and 78th parallels, he made important discoveries, while farther to the northward, Hayes Sound, Bache Island, and other unknown lands and waters were added to our maps through his strenuous exertions. Breaking out his schooner on July 10, 1861, an unprecedentedly early date for an Arctic ship, he quickly decided that he could hope for no further northing in a sailing vessel. However, he crossed the strait to the unvisited shores of Ellesmere Land, where he made such an examination of the coast as was practicable, and then turned his face homeward. Hayes was fully alive to the absolute necessity of steam power for complete Arctic success, but strictly limited means obliged him to go in a sailing vessel or not at all. He plainly foresaw the magnificent success awaiting the first expedition that should carry steam power into Smith Sound, and full of dreams of future Arctic work he impatiently returned to the United States. It was not to be. Civil war raged, and the country called its loyal sons to arms. Hayes was not the man to falter at such a juncture. He at once tendered his schooner to the government for such use as was possible, and volunteered for the war, where his activity as the head of a great war hospital taxed to the utmost the mental and physical powers which had so long been occupied in arduous efforts to solve the riddle of the ice-free sea. Hayes visited Greenland a third time in 1869 with the Arctic artist William Bradford in the steam sealer Panther. Arctic scenery was their quest, and so they visited the fjord of Semitsialik, where the inland ice, which covers the greater part of Greenland, pushes down into the sea as an enormous glacier with a front 2½ miles wide. Here Hayes witnessed the birth of an iceberg, of which he says, "It would be impossible for mere words alone to convey an adequate idea of the action of this new-born child of the Arctic frosts. Think of a solid block of ice, a third of a mile deep and more than half a mile in lateral diameter, hurled like a mere toy away into the water, and set to rolling to and fro by the impetus of the act. Picture this, and you will have an image of power not to be seen by the action of any other forces upon the earth. The disturbance of the water was inconceivably fine. Waves of enormous magnitude were rolled up with great violence against the glacier, covering it with spray, and the billows came tearing down the fjord, their progress marked by the crackling and crumbling ice which was everywhere in a state of the wildest agitation for the space of several miles. The famous mine of creolite, the only valuable mineral deposit in Greenland, the Hope Sanderson of John Davis's great voyage of 1587, with its lofty crest and innumerable flocks of wildfowl. Tesuwisak, the most northerly settlement of Greenland. Duck Islands, the haunts of the eider, and the chosen rendezvous of ice-stayed whalers. Devil's Thumb, the great wonderful pillar, to the base of which Hayes struggled up 1,300 feet above the ice-covered sea, and Sabine Island, all saw the Panther in its pleasure-seeking journey. If no geographical results sprang from this voyage, it had a literary outcome in Hayes's book, The Land of Desolation, and in a series of detached sketches, which in beauty and interest are unsurpassed as regards life in Danish Greenland. Hayes died in New York City, December 17, 1881. To the last he maintained a lively interest in Arctic exploration, and ever and again he favored polar research, always with an alternative scheme of his old harbor, Foulke Fiord, as the base of operations. He resented the appellation Great Frozen Sea as properly characterizing the Arctic Ocean to the north of Greenland, and to the last held fast to the ideal of his youth, the belief of his manhood, the open polar sea. End of chapter 10. Recording by William Tomco.